Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Gaffigan and Zendaya take flight in the animated adventure Duck Goose. Set in China, Peng, voiced by Gaffigan, is an arrogant goose who annoys his fellow geese with his reckless flying and behaviour. When Peng injures his wing and is unable to join them for their migration, he joins up with a pair of young ducklings, Zendaya's Chi and Lance Lim's Chow, that he accidentally separated from their flock with his antics. As they travel, Peng will get his first taste of responsibility, unaware they're being pursued by split personality cat Banzhao, voiced by Greg Proops. As China increasingly comes to play a prominent role in the global film market, we're seeing its influence more and more on Western product, and one way which is quite interesting is in animated films backed with Chinese money and animated in the US and in China, such as the case for 2016's Rock Dog, which is a big flop in both countries. Now we have Duck Goose, the first full film from animation house Original Force, and this was a theatrical release in many territories, such as in China, obviously, and in the UK, where it actually got released quite a few months ago. In the US, it wasn't nearly so lucky. It was intended to have a theatrical release, it was even advertised as one with a trailer and everything, but then the distributor got cold feet and cancelled the release, and thus Netflix acquired it, and that is where it's going to be premiering in the States. And I do have to say that this really does cut out the middleman, because for a film this mediocre, it was destined to end up on the service being used as babysitting material for bored children while their parents do something else. And I've got to be honest, Duck Goose isn't an egg, but really, it's not very good, and something like this only reiterates that Netflix, I don't think, isn't really the future of cinema so much as the future of direct-to-video. If there is something that really did surprise me about this movie, it's the quality of the animation. This is a gorgeous-looking movie by any measure, and that is something I was not anticipating. I'm so used to second-tier animated films looking maybe a little bit under-textured and a bit blockier than their bigger counterparts. That's definitely not the case here. It's obvious that a lot of money has been spent on this movie, and it makes the case that Original Force can compete, certainly with the likes of Illumination or DreamWorks, maybe not Pixar, but there are definitely moments in this movie which are just visually breathtaking, especially moments that are on water, they've got lovely textures there, but especially in flight. Those scenes are easily the visual highlights of the movie and really well done. When the movie wasn't engaging me, and that was happening a lot of the time, I do have to say, at least I was given plenty to look at. And I think it helps that the film has a Chinese setting, which again, I wasn't really aware of when I went into it, so that was something that caught me off guard. But the fact that they did set it there actually gives the film somewhat of a unique look about it, because of the fact that it's a completely different culture that it's set into usual. You don't often see a lot of animated films set in China, especially in Western product, unless they're called Kung Fu Panda, I have to say. But really, I do think that if I had to choose between having really fantastic animation and an actual script, I know which one I'd probably pay for instead. The script here is very, very bland, and I'm putting that mildly. It takes a very generic, well-worn plot of the family road movie, just like Home was, where you have this self-centered, arrogant protagonist who has to forcibly adopt this makeshift family, and they go on a journey together, and over the course of it, they bicker, they fight, but eventually they come to care for each other, and over the course of it, the protagonist learns to care about someone other than himself. They become selfless and reveal a paternal side that they didn't even know they had in them. We've seen so many variations of this kind of storyline, particularly in animated films, and Duck Goose does so little to change up the formula that you could almost set your watch to the plot beats and how they go through the 86-minute running time. And so I've got to be brutally honest here, I spent a lot of this film really bored watching it, because obviously I've seen this movie done better in the past, and even so, that did make me wonder, well, if I'm bored with it, what does that say about kids watching it? Because they're even less forgiving of that sort of thing, because they'll really feel if a movie has dull spots, because they have shorter attention spans, and Duck Goose has plenty of those. I was also wondering, why does this seem even more familiar than it does usually? And I was thinking, why is that? And eventually it hit me. This is a variation of the very first Ice Age movie. It really is. I mean, you got the migration plot, switch out the baby for the ducklings, cut a few of the other characters out. But what really tipped me off is that there's a long section in the midway portion of the film where they're all in an underground cave, just like how midway through Ice Age, there's that long sequence where they're sliding through the underground cavern, and I go, oh, I know what movie that you're kind of replicating, but fudging the details on. Later on, there's this squirrel character that helps out Peng, and he likes to fly. In fact, he even makes a makeshift sort of sling that can work as a glider for Peng's wing, because he flies using a glider, essentially. And that character, that sort of wacky character, I was going, well, that also seems very familiar. Oh, it's a copy of Buck, the weasel voiced by Simon Pegg in the later Ice Age entries. I was watching this movie, and the reason why I was so very, very bored with it is really because it's actually a fairly monotonous movie. I was watching this in a cinema, and you know how a script normally progresses the characters? Duck Goose does a terrible job of doing that. I'll explain why. You know how part of the formula is that the characters have to bicker and fight over things? The middle portion of this movie is generally made up of the characters doing just that. Oh, you're not moving fast enough. I want to be fed. Petty squabbling over and over again, and none of it's really funny. It's just characters whinging at each other for about 2 minutes, and then in the next scene they'll argue about something else, and they'll go right back to where they were at the beginning of the last scene, and I go, come on! You've got to have some progress in these characters. I mean, the only thing that is changing about these scenes is the background. Literally, if you just swapped out the background, these scenes would fit anywhere in this portion of the movie. You could swap them around willy-nilly, and it really wouldn't make a difference to how the film plays out, because there's so little evolution in the relationship between the characters for much of the film. To the point where I actually thought by the cave section that they were on relatively good terms with each other, and then the movie breaks them up for the third act, because it has to do that beat, and so the characters go right back to where they started again. So it just constantly just keeps negating the characters' arcs all across the film. It's very, very frustrating to witness. Another thing that really made me question how much kids would enjoy this movie is on a narrative and storytelling level, especially in regards to the script. I think you can probably tell that I spent a lot of time thinking about other things than what was directly on screen in front of me. But it shouldn't be a hard question to answer. What are kids supposed to get out of a narrative like this particular kind of story? Because I've thought about that in other films that have this kind of plot, but seldom as much as I have during Duck Goose. I think that this is a weirdly kind of misguided film, because it doesn't seem like it's written for kids. It sometimes seems like it's more written for their parents, which is a very strange thing to do, I have to say, because this is the kind of movie where if parents are taken to it, it's usually begrudgingly, and they spend the entirety of the film trying to ignore what's happening by playing on their phones, much to the annoyance of anyone else actually trying to watch it. But in general, it seems like it's not only aimed at parents, but deadbeat parents, weirdly specifically, because the main character in the film, it focuses so much on his parental struggles and the fact that he constantly tries to deny the fact that he's the makeshift father of the group, that it almost seems aimed at parents who haven't quite grasped the fact that they have sired a child yet. It just seems very, very kind of weirdly adult-orientated at points in ways that feel just very, very strange. Sometimes it shows itself in the gags the film has. There's a couple of moments in this movie that seem like the traditional sort of animated film of, oh, well, here's a gag for the grown-ups, but weirdly cynical. For example, there's a moment where they're staying with some chickens, and there's sort of this bickering husband and wife dynamic going on in it, and the husband rooster refers to himself as being whipped. There's a play on words there, and you go, that's kind of weirdly inappropriate for this kind of film, but that's nothing compared to a gag later on in a movie where they're in a Chinese restaurant and Peng is trying to sneak through under the tables, and there's this couple out on a date, and I think Peng gets stepped on or something like that, and Peng pops out under the tablecloth, and it looks like he has an erection. That's right, this children's film has an erection joke in it. It blew my mind. I genuinely couldn't believe what I just witnessed. As if to compensate for that, the film doubles down the humour that kids easily get a giggle out of, namely fart jokes. There are so many fart jokes in this movie that I was wondering when was the last time I saw a major animated film with this much flatulence in it, and it probably goes back about a decade before he criticised them for using that as an easy crutch. But in this movie, they don't know how to get jokes any other way, so anytime it's falling into a lull, fart joke. It's just so very, very lazy. And the film has a lot of garden variety slapstick in it, so it kind of falls into this repetitive rhythm of bicker, 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 slapstick, bicker, 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 slapstick. And the big set piece moments are obviously them going down on a slide or a chase sequence, and they'll combine the two together because they'll end up in the back of a pig cart and they're sliding around, and Peng is unfortunate enough to end up with his head up a pig's bum. I will admit there was a couple of moments that did actually make me laugh, just a couple of moments, normally no more than a chuckle, but the one that really kind of very much caught me by surprise is that there's a moment where one of the ducklings, the plumper one, he's very hungry and he needs something right now, and there's a very quick moment where he suddenly turns all red and his voice gets low and quite demonic sounding. Give me food now! And that was just so out of nowhere that I did genuinely laugh at it, but that was the exception rather than the rule. The film does actually have quite a few names in its voice cast, but weirdly, it's lacking that for its main character. Jim Gaffigan's not an unknown, he's a fairly well-known comedian, but I wouldn't say he's a marquee name. You can actually see a similar phenomenon in Rock Dog, which had a fairly starry cast, but was anchored by Luke Wilson, you know, that big draw. Anyway, I would say that Gaffigan is really ill-suited to this kind of part. In fact, he's wildly miscast here. I would say that ideally, if you were to cast someone like this, it would have to be someone that sounds quite young, maybe a bit cocky and arrogant, but very charismatic, almost certainly a Zac Efron kind of type, I would imagine, although I would have to say that neither of them are really particularly best suited for a character named Peng. Gaffigan delivers his lines with this cynical deadpan all the way through the film, and it just makes the character come off as whiny all the way through it. And we're supposed to like the character, and I didn't. I really didn't, especially because he is so selfish that's kind of amplified by the vocal performance, especially since he lies to his charges and tries to dump them as many times as possible. And Gaffigan's voice work really doesn't endear you to the character. I was really put off by his performance in this movie. You get the impression that they did actually want a major talent in that role, but obviously they were turned down constantly, and what you end up with is maybe about the 42nd choice, and that ends up being Gaffigan. Luckily, there is someone who manages to balance that out somewhat, namely Zendaya. Coming off of a fantastic 2017 of Spider-Man Homecoming and The Greatest Showman, she enlivened this film. I think you can really tell when someone is going to be a star, and I really think she is, when they really put their effort into something as crushingly mediocre as this, and boy, I was thankful for it. I mean, it's not the greatest of material, but even so, she gives that character a sort of back-talking humour that really kind of made the film come to life. She's funnier than anything Gaffigan does throughout the entirety of the movie, and she sounds so much more natural. She's very well cast in this film, in what is obviously going to be a footnote on her CV. I mean, obviously, she probably recorded this before the live-action roles that came out last year, because that's just how these sort of things work, and she really does deserve a better animated film than this one. There are quite a few other names in the movie, like Carl Reiner. 96-year-old Carl Reiner's in this film. He appears in the first act of this movie as Peng's turtle friend, and he has a couple of old creaky jokes that he tells, and then he disappears out of the movie. Like, no joke, they do a gag where he's rushing off to tell the heroes that they're in danger, and that gag does not come back until midway through the credits. That's right, they push Reiner so far off screen that most people probably wouldn't even know that he came back at the end. You also have Stephen Fry and Craig Ferguson as a pair of very critical, very pompous birds that make fun of Peng, very much as a double act, similar to sort of Statler and Waldorf. I like the concept of their characters more than the execution of it, because, again, they only really take prominence in the first portion of the movie. They appear intermittently when the film keeps cutting back to the rest of the geese, but otherwise they are off screen for most of the movie, which I think is very, very odd, because they've obviously spent a lot on casting big names, but then it just pushes them aside for the majority of the running time. The person that really runs away with this movie, though, is easily Whose Line Is It Anyway star Greg Proops. He voices the villain of the movie, a cat named Banzhao, and this cat has a split personality. He is by far the most memorable element of the movie, because there'll be scenes where he's having conversations between himself like Gollum. It really is like that. Like, he has two eyes that are different colours, and he'll blink between each one, depending on which one's speaking, which personality it is. And I thought that was really kind of unique and creative in a way that almost nothing else about this movie is. That character is actually surprisingly intimidating. I mean, obviously, they involve him in a lot of slapstick and prankery all the way through the film, which diminishes his threat. But even so, I think for younger viewers, they might actually be genuinely scared of him, and I actually say that's a little bit of an accomplishment. It's nice to have a villain in this kind of movie that actually poses a sense of danger in this film. They're not completely a comical buffoon. There are worse animated films than Duck Goose. As I said, the animation is brilliant, but the story is so flat and so uninspired that Netflix really is the best place for this to have landed, because this wouldn't have survived very long in cinemas. And I guess if you've got a rainy day and you need something to entertain the kids in a pinch, this will probably do the trick. It's just about parcel, but even so, I do wonder if kids will actually be entertained by it, or whether they want to watch Toy Story again instead. And that's the thing. Considering the quality of the animated films that are out at the moment, like the fantastic Incredibles 2 or Hotel Transylvania 3, why settle for this instead? I mean, even on Netflix's services, there are probably animated films that they'll want to watch again and again and again over this one. But I guess if you've got the service and it's there, you can try it out, and who knows, maybe your kid will like it after all. No harm, no foul. Duck Goose is an ultimately harmless but very dull animation that is let down by a script that is as repetitive as it is routine. It goes through a stock plot of a character learning to accept parenthood of his makeshift family that I don't think will engage kids, and the script repeats itself over and over again, largely made of a constant bickering between the main characters where only the backdrop changes and any in them is negated. This isn't helped by a wildly miscast Jim Gaffigan as the lead, who comes across as whiny and self-absorbed. But But despite the efforts of a strong cast that includes Zendaya, Carl Reiner, Stephen Fry and Craig Ferguson, there's little that they can do to elevate this bland material. Luckily, the film can boast stunning quality visuals for a second-tier animated film helped by the Chinese setting, and Greg Proops steals the show as a surprisingly sinister Gollum-esque villain. But this is simply a fart joke-heavy rehash of Ice Age to mildly distract kids. If you like this review, then you can migrate over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.